Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted that you are part of our beautiful Reading with Your Kids family. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast. We have a wonderful guest for you today. He is the author of the Harwood Mysteries. We are excited to introduce you to Antony Kolenc. You may remember that Antony was part of the Catholic teen authors group that created that beautiful original short story for our Christmas episode. We called it Christmas Life. Anthony was part of that great group, and we're really excited to have him back to talk about his YA series. Hey, we also want to let you know we have some amazing guests coming up in the next few weeks. Father James Martin. Father James Martin will be on. I'm a big fan of Father James Martin. He's coming on to celebrate his brand new book, Learning to Pray. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Jessica Laurel Kane is coming back to the show. She has a brand new book and is excited to share it with us. And Laurie Walmark will be helping us celebrate the start of International Women's History Month. That's the month of March. She'll be here to celebrate Codebreaker, Spy Hunter. All that and more coming up here on the Reading with Your Kids podcast. You don't want to miss an episode, so please go to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, sign up for our newsletter, and also please be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcast. Joining us right now from Jacksonville in Florida, where it's warm and sunny, and I am cold and miserable here in Boston. We're going to be celebrating his great new series called The Harwood Mysteries. Please welcome to the show, Antony Kolenc. Anthony, how are you?
I am doing very well. Thank you, Jen.
I was stumbling on myself, making sure I didn't put the H in Antony.
Call me Tony, actually. I go by Tony as my go-by name.
So Tony is here to celebrate Shadow in the Dark, which is the first in the Harwood Mysteries. Why don't we begin just by you letting us know all about the Shadow in the Dark?
Great. Well, Shadow in the Dark is, like you said, the first book in a series put out by Loyola Press in Chicago. And it is a medieval series, kind of an adventure mystery series, even historical fiction, if you will. And it takes place in 12th century England. It's about a boy who his village gets attacked by bandits, and he winds up getting raised, if you will, at a nearby Benedictine abbey by the monks of Harwood Abbey, hence Harwood Mysteries. And pretty much in this first book, Shadow in the Dark, which I could show you this beautiful cover that Loyola came up with. But in the first book, Shadow in the Dark, they really, the monks are trying to help him, find his parents. He's trying to figure out, what happened. He loses his memory. After the attack, and so he's basically not even sure, who am I? Where are my parents? Are they still alive? Why are these bandits attacking? And then there's this mysterious figure, almost like the Grim Reaper, if you will, who the orphans at the abbey see roaming around the abbey grounds at night, and he is the Shadow, and that's the Shadow in the Dark. And all of these things sort of tie together in this mystery that Zan has to solve, all while he's still trying to figure out, who am I and where's my family and why is all this terrible stuff happening to me.
Wow. Talk about exciting. It's as you were describing it, I could almost put myself back in that time, and especially seeing myself as a kid in middle school and in high school really getting into the story.
Yeah, there's been great feedback. The readers love the book because it's exciting. It's a mystery. It's an adventure. So kids love it. Parents like it because there's a lot of very good, family values and moral themes and some religious themes. He's being raised by monks after all, and but he's also struggling with different kind of faith-related issues. So, I tried to really, hit both ends, if you will.
Yeah. Now, Loyola is a name that I am very familiar with. I was educated at a Jesuit high school. Loyola was that name rings out in all sorts of Jesuit institutions. So it's a Catholic press, but can a non-Catholic, non-Christian get into these stories and enjoy them?
Absolutely. It's primarily, an organic story. It takes place in 12th century England in a Benedictine abbey, but the reality is, this was, 300 years before the Protestant Reformation. There's really, this was Christianity in the West. And so, Catholic, Protestant, and frankly, it's not specifically a religious book. Sometimes it feels a little bit like a religious book because it's taking place in an abbey with monks, and Zan is struggling with sort of real life struggles for a boy at that time. But the reality is I've had, all different types of readers, read it and enjoy it. And, even, some of the editors at Loyola had, believe it or not, one of my editors was an agnostic. And he was like, he just really enjoyed the book. He just said, anything religious in there is just organic to the story. So, it doesn't come across as preachy or, anything like that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you didn't start life as a children's author. Talk a little bit about the path that you took and how you ended up at this place.
Well, I've always, even as a teenager, I liked to write stories. I, read The Lord of the Rings, and I try to write my little Lord of the Rings knockoff stories, which are terrible. And then, I went through my life, I joined the Air Force. I spent 21 years in the Air Force. I was and still am an attorney, and I'm a law school professor now. So, but this whole time I've been writing, on the side just because I enjoyed writing. And then, I've got 5 children, and we started homeschooling our kids. Now, of course, my youngest is a sophomore in college, but, at the time I started writing the series, my kids were still in high school or middle school, and especially my son at the time, when I started this was, in that age range. And so I sort of said, hey, let me try to write something that I would want my kids to be reading. As a homeschooling parent, this was when Harry Potter was, really hitting its stride when I started this project. And I said, it'd be great to have something that was just as spooky and neat and exciting as Harry Potter, but also something that any homeschooling family or anybody else could pick up and give to their kids and just enjoy it. So started writing it and actually got a lot of inputs from my son. My wife, Elisa, was instrumental in making sure I kept the story on a good path. And, there's a lot of other things I could talk about, but that's the gist of how it happened.
Yeah. We met Antony because he was part of a really amazing episode that we broadcast here on the Reading with Your Kids podcast on Christmas Day. We brought 7 authors from CatholicTeenBooks.com together, and they took a prompt that I gave them, a little silly prompt, and they wove this beautiful and really fun tale of that was filled with emotions and suspense and mystery and faith, and it was really wonderful. Why is that faith component? Why is that important to have in stories from your perspective?
It's part of who we are as people, and it's a part that's, desperately neglected by the rest of the world. And so that's part of the reason I wanted to set my stories in a place where faith was organic, where, we're worrying about God and worrying about the church and worrying about, having faith was part of people's lives. They talked about it, and we just don't, in our society, we've divorced faith from our storytelling in so many ways. And so a lot of the Catholic authors, which by the way, I'd never done anything like that before, and that was a blast. And and I was paired up with these wonderful, authors. The only male, by the way, as you saw, among all these wonderful female Catholic teen, writers.
And I just have to interject. The only author of that group that made a comment about how cute one of the characters were.
The main character was a girl, so she was looking at this boy that was a potential. She had to speak her mind. But there are a lot of us out there who are trying to make sure that aspect of who we are as people is kept as part of our storytelling. The reality is, I'm sure many of your listeners, have that as part of their lives. And where do you go to sort of be able to read a cool, awesome story and also not have that entirely, neglected? I think if we don't have these kinds of stories, we're missing out on part of our humanity.
And when you look back at history, I think a lot of people think that, the way the faith was handed down from generation to generation was by people going into a church or a mosque or a synagogue and just sitting there and having it pounded into them. When in the reality is our faith has been passed down to us pretty much by story.
Yeah, even just walk into any traditional church and you look at the stained glass windows. That's how, especially in this time period that I'm writing about, where we had, literacy was just not known outside of the monasteries, or the highly educated elite. The typical person, that's how they learned their faith, was by looking at, hearing stories, looking at stained glass windows and having that tell the story. And heck, Jesus taught by telling stories. I feel like if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me.
Yeah, you were mentioning the old cathedrals. There is a basilica in right outside of Quebec City. It's the Basilica of Saint Anne's de Beaupré. I know I killed that pronunciation, but throughout this beautiful church, the entire Bible is told on there's one book of the Bible that's told on the floor. There's another book of the Bible that's told in one of the ceilings, and of course all the stained glass. And we had this tour around the basilica, and it was just amazing. And it was true, yeah, when these beautiful cathedrals and basilicas and churches were built, so many of the people attending couldn't read, and the only way that they could get the lessons, experience the lessons, was through these stories, was through this artwork.
Yeah, and bringing it back to our kids today, that's not maybe their experience with how they're learning stories, but when they're not watching television, especially when they're younger, hopefully they're reading, and they're reading things like Harry Potter or Rick Riordan and those novels, and so I feel like we should be creating exciting fiction to be able to pass on these kinds of stories. And again, there's a lot of spooky scenes in Shadow in the Dark. There's some suspense. It won the 2020 Moonbeam Children's Book Award for the YA category of suspense, thriller, horror. They lumped them all into one category. It didn't win in a religious category. It won in the suspense category. Because there's a lot of suspense, and I think kids are probably, attuned to that kind of a story, and that's what, in some ways, that's how our storytelling today has sort of trained our kids to, be looking at that. But think about the Grimm fairy tales. There was a lot of suspense and scariness in those too. So I think this is a universal human way of communicating information.
Yeah. Boy, the first time I read the original Grimm fairy tales, I was horrified.
Yeah, thankfully I don't go that far. My book is not as scary as fairy tales, but it's suspenseful in some parts, because Xana's at one point has to decide if he's going to follow this shadow out in the middle of the night to try to see what it really is, and not knowing if he's going to survive the night.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As we're speaking here, I'm reminded of being at a school in between, I was doing 2 of my educational magic shows at the school, and I'd finished the first one, and I think there was an art teacher there, and as I'm getting ready for the second show, he came up to me and he said, "Boy, aren't you tired of using your art to deliver a message? Wouldn't you just love to get out there and just do your show, do your art, and not worry about a message?" And I responded to him, "No, the reason I do my art is to deliver these messages." And one of the things that I didn't say to him, because it didn't strike me until later, is every story has a message in it. And and we need to be aware of that. When we're not talking about religion, we're talking about something else, and we need to, kind of as artists, as parents, as readers, be aware of what these stories are saying to us. And I think it's one of the reasons we really encourage families to continue to read with their kids as they get older, is just helping kids understand what it is that they're reading and what to become media literate, so that they understand that this story was created by somebody, and that somebody had intention in creating this story, and let's dig down and see what that intention was.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. And being around a lot of writers and going to a lot of workshops over the years, you realize there's no accidents here. Mm-hmm. Any story that's written or put on TV or the movies, nothing is accidental. Everything is planned. Everything is there for a reason. And there is a message. The message, we might not really want the message when we pull back the story and look at what the creator was doing. And that's why I think, like you're saying, people like you or I or my fellow authors in the Catholic, Writers Guild, we recognize that there's a story. And the other thing you mentioned is the schools. I haven't really emphasized this, but, the book is also sort of a work of historical fiction. And in the series, there's going to be other historical events that are brought forth. And it's a great way for kids to learn about medieval life, monastic life, the Middle Ages in general. We're going to be talking about the Crusades in some of the later books. And so I'm really also trying to encourage, families and teachers to incorporate the series into like a middle school English or history curriculum as like a supplemental reading. There's always other books that they want to put in there. So that's something that I hope this year Loyola and I will be working on, is really trying to get the series into the schools for that reason.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk to you a little bit in a minute about what drew you to this time period. But first, you were mentioning that your family made the choice to homeschool your kids. And it's not a choice that we made, but we did make the choice to try to be as involved in our kids' school as possible. One of the things that concerns me overall is that I think for a lot of families, school and home life are becoming separate. There's this kind of a wall going up, and kids go to school and then they come home, and there's not that involvement. There's not that discussion about what's being learned at the school, and
right.
That concerns me. I don't know. Was that one of the reasons that you chose to do the homeschooling?
Yeah, that was definitely one thing. Was just my wife, thankfully, was able to be a stay-at-home mom, and she's a great mom, and always wanted to have that maximum interaction with the kids. Number one, I was in the military, so we were moving around every 2 to 3 years. So it made more sense for continuity's sake to also do homeschooling for a good portion of their time. But yeah, you're right. We've sort of, as parents, have punted the education of our kids to the schools to the point where a lot of parents don't even feel like they have a role doing that anymore. Like they don't want to get in the teacher's way. And I love about homeschoolers is they recognize that that's exactly, upside down. Of course, what homeschoolers struggle with is then mommy is always also teacher. Mm-hmm. And so there's that, dynamic. And so there has to be some balance there. But, I think you're right that, parents need to get involved with what's going on in their kids' education. And especially nowadays, if they're sending them to public school, parents really need to know the kinds of messages that the schools are giving to their kids also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, this is an interesting period of time. What drew you to this Middle Ages time period?
I sometimes wonder that because, I'm actually mostly Italian in my background. My grandparents both came over through Ellis Island on the boat. I have like zero ties to England. And yet, for some reason, maybe just because I grew up, learning American history and English history, I sort of gravitated to kind of be a little Anglophile over here. I started questioning myself at this stage of my life, like, why do I love England so much, But I thought English history was fascinating. This time in history is actually a really interesting time. It's between the Second and Third Crusades, and the fact the Third Crusade is about to start up. And I really wanted Zan to, potentially be influenced or potentially even go into a crusade at some point. And so that was part of the reasoning. It's an interesting time in church history. There's a lot of conflict between King Henry II and the Pope. Saint Thomas of Becket was just, martyred a few years before this. A lot of cool things are happening in the world just a few years after this with Saint Dominic and Saint Francis. So there's just a lot of really interesting things going on. And yet it's still so far in the back that feudalism and that whole system was in place. And so it's a good place to sort of teach medieval history. I felt like it was, putting my pin in the exact right spot to be able to, too much history hadn't gone by yet in the Middle Ages, but enough had gone by so that, a lot of these themes had developed. And I don't know, I just find that it's a very interesting period.
Yeah. And I imagine, too, for a lot of kids, especially kids of faith, it would be interesting for them, too, to see how things have changed, where at one point the church was so important in everybody's life, and to nowadays where, sadly, in my opinion, church is just something you might do on Sundays.
Right. Yeah, and that's where the organic part of the story comes in, because, when you're living at an abbey in the Middle Ages, the entire, and I mean, this is the case if you're living at an abbey now, but, the entire, focus of life at the abbey is, in fact, prayer. The monks were almost single-handedly saving the works of Western civilization from the Greeks and the Romans, and copying the scriptures by hand and preserving, these manuscripts. And so everything sort of was revolving around that at the abbey. And so I thought that was a neat place to put a kid who, is sort of struggling with his faith, if you will, because there's a lot of bad things that wind up happening to him. And you're right. It's just organic to their way of life. And we've lost that, at least in some places in our society. Obviously, the religious life, that's still their focus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And one of the things, as you were speaking, I'm thinking one of the things, in addition just to talking about the story, he's growing up in a Benedictine abbey. That would be a great launching point for families, especially Catholic families, just to start having discussions about how diverse our church is. You mentioned there's Benedictines, there's Jesuits, there's Salesians, there are all sorts of different orders, and there are also different branches of the church. Most of us, when we think Catholic, we think Roman Catholic, but there's also Eastern churches that are in communion with Rome and are just as Catholic as, someone who go down to the church in my neighborhood here.
Yes, and that's the other thing I liked about this period of history. The Benedictines actually had experienced a lot of sort of decay as an order in about the 100 years leading up to the story. We had the rise of the Cistercians and the white monks. The Benedictines were the black monks because of the black robes they wore. And so there was a lot of reform going on in the church too. And you see a lot of diversity. It's not as apparent in this first book, but as the series goes on, Zan sort of leaves the abbey and he gets exposed to some of this. And then, of course, with the Crusades going on, there's a lot of exposure beyond just your little area of the world when you're going to be traveling around. But, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Now, the second book will be coming out soon, I understand. What's the name of that book?
It's called The Haunted Cathedral. And, it should be coming out in mid-February 2021. And, I'm pinpointing the exact date with Loyola this week. But, in that book, and by the way, I haven't mentioned, and I'm totally neglected this, Zan has a female counterpart, his sort of partner in crime on this, and her name is Lucy. So I don't want our female listeners to think that there aren't any female characters. Lucy is a girl who's at the convent on the Abbey grounds, who actually is a really great role model for girls, today. She's smart, and spunky, and sort of a way that we can appreciate today, but she's also somebody who's, got a very holy disposition as a young girl. Both of them about 12 years old in this first, book, 11, 12 years old. But anyway, so, Dan and Lucy wind up, traveling away from the Abbey, to this, place in Lincoln, to Lincoln Cathedral, which, again, there's a big historical event, which I won't give away, which goes on at the cathedral in history. But they kind of get wrapped up in this historical event as they try to figure out, is this cathedral haunted by a ghost of a little girl who had died? And some of the people they see there think that maybe the cathedral is haunted. And so there's a whole mystery that goes on in that second one. And a lot of that book takes place outside of the Abbey. It starts and finishes at the Abbey, but there's a whole journey in that one.
Yeah. As you were speaking, I just had this flashback. My daughter got into, who, by the way, just became engaged. We're so excited for her.
Congratulations.
Yeah. She became engaged to her, to the person who's been her best friend since 4th grade.
Wow.
And so we're just delighted. But around that time, when she was in 3rd or 4th grade, she just got into this period where she loved watching those ghost hunter shows. And it was, no one else would watch it with her. And so I would sit down, and it was wonderful because it was a great transition from sitting down and reading every night to, we're taking what we used to do with a book, and we're transferring it to this story. And we would be talking about, how come this is the 50th show that we've watched and they haven't found anything yet? But we were at church once, and we were listening to the gospel, and it was when Jesus was resurrected, and he went, and he was eating, and he said, "Hey, I'm not a ghost. Ghosts don't eat, and I'm here." And my daughter turned to me, and when she heard that, and she goes, "Look, ghosts are real. Jesus talked about ghosts, so they're real. So we got to keep watching that show."
Yeah, no, and there's actually in the second book, which by the way takes place during Lent in 1185. So it's a great book for Lent. I'm glad Loyola is releasing it because it ends on Good Friday, and there's a lot of discussion about the Lenten process there in the Middle Ages, but one of the discussions in the book is Zan has that exact kind of a reaction to his mentor, Brother Andrew, because Brother Andrew is not very happy with the idea of a cathedral being haunted by a ghost. And so they have this whole discussion. Well, what is the difference between a saint and a ghost? And, why do you believe in this, Brother Andrew, but you don't believe in ghosts? And it was a nice way to sort of introduce that concept, because obviously as Catholics, at least, we don't think that after you die, you suddenly disappear. I mean, there's obviously an ongoing presence in the communion of saints. And so the book, I think, makes it a good discussion point even for that.
Yeah. Hey, so much to talk about. Such a great story, but also just a great jumping off point for hours and hours of conversations with family. And that's what we love here at the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Tony, where can people go to find out more about you and more about the Harwood Mysteries?
Great. Well, you can go to my website, which is www.antonykolenc.com, ANTONY Kolenc. Or you could just Google Shadow in the Dark, and you'll wind up at Loyola Press's website or Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And I always like to put a plug in for our local bookstores, especially go to your local Catholic bookstore, and if it's not already on the shelf, have them stock it and buy it from them too. I think we need to support local when we can.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we've said it before, it is so great. It is so helpful for authors. It's so helpful for those indie bookstores to go into the bookstore, call up ahead of time. You don't want to waste time. Give them a call and say, hey, do you have Shadows in the Dark by Antony Kolenc? And they say, no, we don't. Then the next question is, well, when can it be there? We want to buy it from you. How soon can you get it for us? And they'll be happy to help you out.
Yeah, I love that. And, I know with the pandemic, Amazon is becoming even larger than before, but and there is a need for that. But like you said, with just a little bit of patience, we can support our local bookstores, and I do want to encourage that.
Yeah. We've had a great time talking about a whole lot of things, but especially talking about the Harwood Mysteries and the first book in the series, Shadow in the Dark, with our guest, Antony Kolenc. Hey, Tony, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Jed. It's been a pleasure.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Evita Hiron. She'll be here to celebrate her beautiful picture book, The Girl with Magical Curls. I wish I had I used to have magical curls. Curls or no curls, we want to thank the folks who made today's show so very wonderful. Of course, we want to thank our guest, Antony Kolenc. Also want to thank my team, Alejandro Doherty, Fatima Khan. Want to thank our intern, Alexia Brown. Want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.